The night was thick with the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves as Sarah and her friends approached the imposing silhouette of the dark villa. Tucked deep within the forest, it had stood abandoned for decades, its stone walls crumbling and its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the encroaching gloom. Whispers had circulated for years, tales of disappearances, strange occurrences, and a haunting presence that drove people to madness. But tonight, armed with nothing but their curiosity and a burning desire to prove the stories were nothing more than folklore, they crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the dust of forgotten years. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the flickering beams of their flashlights cast long, unsettling shadows that seemed to move on their own. As they explored room after room, they found no signs of life, just empty halls, faded tapestries and furniture draped in white sheets, as if the house had been frozen in time. But there was something else in the air, something unspoken and sinister that seemed to tighten around them with every step. A sense of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every movement. When Sarah found the old portrait, the one that hung crookedly on the wall at the far end of the corridor, her heart skipped a beat. The faces in the painting seemed to shift, the expressions darkening as though the figures were aware of their intrusion. The longer she stared, the more the faces seemed to distort warped smiles, eyes that glinted with malice. She quickly turned away, but the unease lingered, pressing against her chest. It wasn't until they reached the basement door that things began to unravel. The door, sealed with thick iron bolts, seemed oddly out of place, its surface covered in strange symbols, some of which appeared to shimmer faintly in the light. An inexplicable pull urged them to open it. As soon as the door creaked open, the temperature dropped, a biting cold that seemed to seep into their bones. The basement stretched out before them like a vast, hollow pit, the only sound the echo of their breath and the distant, unsettling drip of water. There was a strange, metallic scent in the air, and as they descended the narrow stairs, walls seemed to close in on them, as though the house itself was alive, watching them with a malevolent hunger. The shadows here were thicker, more tangible, curling and writhing in the corners of their vision. At the bottom of the stairs they found a series of old, rusted cages, their iron bars twisted and broken. Some were empty, but others held remnants of something: bones, scraps of clothing and marks on the floor that suggested violent struggles. Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting brief, violent shadows across the room. It was then they heard it, a low, guttural noise from the farthest corner. A figure, cloaked in tattered rags, crouched in the shadows, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. Before they could react, the figure lunged toward them with terrifying speed, its gnarled hands reaching for their throats. The group scattered, the air thick with panic as they raced up the stairs. The house seemed to shift around them, doors slamming shut, hallways elongating, leading them in circles. No matter where they turned, they couldn't find their way back to the entrance. And all the while, the walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat, a slow, rhythmic thumping that filled their minds with dread. Sarah's flashlight finally gave out, plunging them into suffocating darkness, and she felt something brush against her leg, a cold, clammy touch that sent a wave of terror through her body. Screams echoed through the house as one by one her friends disappeared, dragged into the shadows by unseen forces. Sarah tried to scream, but the air was thick in her lungs, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. She stumbled through the maze of corridors, desperate to escape, but every door she opened led her deeper into the heart of the house. The house was alive in a way that made her skin crawl. The paintings had returned, their faces now leering at her, their eyes following her every move. And with each passing second, the house seemed to grow darker, colder, until the darkness was all-encompassing, swallowing her whole. Her mind teetered on the edge of madness as she stumbled into the villa's central chamber. There, standing in the center of the room, was a massive, ornate mirror. Its frame twisted and contorted in unnatural shapes, its surface rippling like liquid. As she approached, Sarah saw something shift within the glass, something that was not her own reflection. A figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, stared back at her. It raised its hand, pressing it against the glass, and Sarah screamed as the figure did the same, its long, bony fingers reaching toward her. In the instant her scream echoed through the villa, The air seemed to crack and tear apart. The house groaned in agony, its walls shuddering as if it were about to collapse in on itself. The last thing Sarah saw was the reflection of the figure emerging from the mirror, stepping out into the real world, its eyes filled with unspeakable hunger. And then there was nothing. The dark villa stood silent once again, its doors and windows sealed tight, waiting for the next group of foolish souls to wander into its clutches. The hours that followed Sarah's scream seemed to stretch into an eternity, a void of silence and waiting. Outside, the forest whispered in the wind, its trees standing like silent sentinels around the dark villa, as if they too were afraid to make a sound. But within the villa, the air was heavy with something far worse than silence. It was a presence that lingered in the shadows, a malevolent force that fed on fear and despair. The mirror in the central chamber no longer reflected Sarah, but something else, something darker, something twisted. The figure that had emerged from the glass stood motionless, its gaunt form casting no shadow on the floor, as though it existed in a space beyond reality. Its hollow eyes blinked slowly, one after the other, its lips curling into that same twisted grin. It made no move to advance, but the very air around it grew thick, as though it were drawing all the light from the room, leaving nothing but darkness in its wake. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a soft scratching sound began. At first it was barely audible, like the distant scurrying of rats in the walls. But it grew louder, sharper, more insistent. The scratching morphed into something else, something heavier, like claws scraping against stone. Then, a series of loud thuds echoed from upstairs, followed by the faint, breathless laughter of a child. At the farthest end of the villa, in the forgotten attic, Emily, one of Sarah's friends who had managed to escape the creature's grasp earlier, huddled in a corner, trembling. Her body ached with exhaustion, and her mind swirled with feverish, fragmented thoughts. She had no idea how long she had been hiding, nor how many of her friends were still alive. All she could hear was the relentless noise of the house creaking walls, whispers in languages she didn't understand, and something else, the soft, clicking of footsteps moving through the darkness. The attic was a claustrophobic, suffocating place, filled with old trunks and forgotten relics, but there was something peculiar about the shadows there, something that didn't belong. They shifted unnaturally, stretching out toward her like fingers, trying to grasp her, pull her into their embrace. Emily pressed herself deeper into the corner, her heart pounding, praying she had not been noticed. Her breath hitched when she saw it, a figure, crouched in the farthest corner of the attic, its face obscured by the hood of a dark cloak. "Please leave me alone," she whispered to the shadow, but it did not respond. Instead, the figure raised its head slowly, revealing its hollow, eyeless sockets, just like the creature that had pursued them through the house. Emily's pulse raced as the figure began to crawl toward her, its limbs contorting unnaturally, its mouth opening in a grotesque grin. But just before it could reach her, there was a loud crash from below. A door slammed open, and the house seemed to exhale, releasing the tension that had been building within it. Emily did not hesitate. She leapt to her feet, her legs shaking, and bolted for the stairs. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she descended into the lower levels, every step feeling like a trap, the walls tightening in around her. Meanwhile, Sarah's reflection in the mirror remained still, the creature's sinister smile never wavering. Her scream had fractured something in the house, something old and ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to claim her and anyone else foolish enough to enter its grasp. The mirror no longer showed the villa's grand entrance, but a twisted version of it, where the walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and the dark figure stood waiting, beckoning others to cross the threshold. The house was not merely haunted. It was alive, and it fed on the souls of the lost, twisting them into something new. Those who entered the villa were never truly gone. They became part of the house, their spirits bound to its dark history, trapped in an eternal nightmare. Down in the basement, the cages rattled once more. The air was thick with whispers, as though the walls themselves were speaking, telling stories of those who had come before Sarah, of those who had disappeared into the shadows, only to return as twisted echoes of their former selves. Their voices were faint, distant, but unmistakable in their sorrow and terror. And then came the soft clicking of nails on stone, once again closer, faster, growing in intensity. The shadows that had been creeping up the walls seemed to grow bolder now, stretching towards Sarah's feet like hungry mouths. With nowhere left to run, Sarah turned back to the mirror, her mind fractured with terror. It was her only chance to understand. Maybe if she could confront the thing inside, face it directly, she could break free. Maybe she could stop the cycle. But as she stepped closer, the mirror began to ripple once more, and the figure, no longer an illusion, reached through, its hand pressing against the glass, distorting the surface like water. Sarah staggered back, her body locked in terror, but it was too late. The house had claimed her. Outside, the storm broke, and the wind howled through the trees. The dark villa loomed in the distance, its windows glowing faintly, like eyes peering into the night, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too close. And somewhere, deep within its cursed halls, the house waited, its hunger never sated, its thirst for souls endless. The cycle would never end, for the dark villa was not just a place, it was a thing that lived, that thrived on fear and death. And it would always be hungry. The storm had finally subsided, but the night still felt thick with the weight of something unnatural. The dark villa stood silent against the clearing skies, its windows dark and empty like eyes watching the forest, waiting. The air was heavy with the echo of screams that had long since died out, as though the house had swallowed them whole, leaving no trace but a faint, unsettling whisper carried by the breeze. Inside the villa, the oppressive silence was broken only by the low hum of something ancient and alive. The air felt thick, almost viscous, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The mirror, now cracked and warped, was the focal point of this stillness, its surface rippling with an unnatural darkness. The twisted figure that had once emerged from it stood motionless before it, as though it were frozen in time. But there was a disturbance now, a faint sound like the shuffle of feet, followed by a low, guttural whisper that crawled through the corridors of the villa. It was the sound of something moving, something alive, and it was coming from the farthest corners of the house, the places where the darkness had always been thickest, where the air tasted of forgotten fear. In the central chamber, where the figure had first emerged, Emily stood at the base of the stairs. Her breath was shallow, her legs weak with exhaustion, but her eyes sharp, focused, scanned the room. She had thought she had escaped, she had almost made it out. But the door had slammed shut before she could reach it, and the house had begun to move once again. Now, she understood. The house had never let her go. It had only allowed her to believe for a fleeting moment that she had escaped its grasp. Emily. The voice was soft at first, a whisper barely audible above the house's creaking. It slithered through her, cold and familiar, as though it had always been with her, just waiting for the right moment to speak. She turned sharply toward it, her pulse quickening. It wasn't her friends, at least, not the friends she had known. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Sarah, or at least it looked like Sarah. Her face was gaunt, pale, her eyes hollow and dark, like empty sockets. Her body moved with unnatural jerks, as if every step were painful, every movement forced. But there was something else in her, the way she smiled, the way her eyes flickered with something darker, something predatory. You're not real, Emily whispered, backing away, her legs shaking. Sarah's smile widened, the corners of her mouth stretching far too wide. No, I am real. We are all real now, Emily. We've always been here. Her voice was hollow, distorted. It was as though she was speaking from within a void, every word heavy with the weight of centuries. The house has claimed you too. You can't leave, not now. Not anymore. Emily stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what Sarah was saying. It wasn't just Sarah who was lost. The house had taken them all, every single one. The spirits of those who had come before her, friends, strangers, everyone who had entered the villa had been absorbed, twisted, reshaped into something else entirely. They were not dead. They were part of the house now. The walls of the villa groaned in response, a low, guttural sound, as though the house itself were speaking. Shadows coiled in the corners of the room, drawing closer, wrapping themselves around her like chains. The door behind her was gone now, replaced by a solid mass of inky blackness that pressed in on all sides. "You won't escape," Sarah hissed, her mouth parting wider, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long, a grotesque imitation of something human. "None of us ever do." Emily turned to flee, her heart hammering, but the shadows were already upon her, crawling over the floor, stretching from the walls like tendrils of darkness. They reached for her, pulling at her ankles, dragging her down, as though the very villa was alive, hungry, and eager to consume her. In the basement, the cages rattled once more, as though someone was being forced into them, locked away to join the others. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, like the cries of the lost, their voices growing more distorted with each passing second. Sarah's figure collapsed into the shadows, the darkness swallowing her whole. The last thing Emily saw was the twisted reflection of herself in the mirror, as she was pulled into the dark, a warped version of her face, pale and distorted, eyes wide with terror. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the walls. And then, nothing. Silence. The dark villa stood once more in the moonlight, still and eternal, waiting for the next wanderer to come too close. The forest around it had grown quiet again, the wind no longer howling, the trees now just silent witnesses to the endless cycle that would continue forever. For those trapped within, there was no escape. The house never stopped hunger, and it would always be hungry. The dark villa would always be waiting.